I can remember being absolutely enthralled by arcade gaming at a very young age. I was born in the mid-1970s, so right as my interest in gaming began, the arcade blossomed into its very own golden age. It was here when things jumped from the old electromechanical and black and white games to software that was much more impressive visually while offering a ton new variety in regards to gameplay. Arcade businesses were popping up everywhere, and it wasn't hard finding your favorite games at local convenience stores, malls, and everywhere in between. These games had such a profound effect on me as a child, it would shape my preferences for years to come. Around that time, console gaming began to really explode as well, with Atari's VCS or 2600 selling millions of units in the United States alone. Among its library would be the very first arcade ports I'd play. Sometimes these conversions were quite good, while other times they were absolutely dreadful. In part 1 here, we're going to take a stroll down memory lane and go over some of my favorite titles when I began first playing arcade games and the home versions that would follow. These games were released during the period between 1978 and 1984, an extremely impressionable time in my youth. I've got some real classics for you here, so let's get started. My earliest memories are pretty vivid for Space Invaders. I was too young to play it myself or be any good at it, but I remember my uncles and older cousins going apeshit crazy for it when it came out. I believe this shaped my excitement for arcade games in general, because I was always the tag-along, always the watcher, and their interest and enthusiasm is all I really knew. My cousins would take me with them when they played it at the gas station down the street, and I was happy to just be there. They thought arcade games were the coolest things ever, so in turn that meant I did as well. I was around 5 or 6 when this was going on, so not only was I impressionable, but it was really the very first time I had really spent any time with a game, be it playing it or watching it. The influence this time period had on me is pretty important. It was my first exposure to arcade gaming and I wanted to see more, which didn't take long because Space Invaders came home to the Atari 2600 soon after. The port was actually really solid. The arcade was a fairly simple game itself, so capturing the essence of that gameplay wasn't going to be too hard. Again, I was super young, so my memories are more flashes of everyone else wanting to play it and me tagging along within that excitement. It sold like crazy on the 2600 too, becoming one of the most recognizable titles in the early 1980s. Hot on the heels of seeing Space Invaders came the Namco hit Galaxian. This one really blew me away because it was so much more dynamic and colorful. These enemies didn't wait to be destroyed, they were much more aggressive and difficult. Being the age I was, it was pretty much the same as before, my older family members playing it while I watched. This didn't dull the excitement at all. Again, they were having fun, and I was just happy to be included. Every so often I got a chance to play it a bit, and while I died quickly, it was exciting as hell to be given a chance at all. My memories of this one are very similar to the ones for Space Invaders. It's more flashes of being included with my family and their love of gaming rubbing off on me. And man, they sure did love this one. It took a few years to show up on the Atari 2600, but when it did, it again did a damn fine job overall of capturing the feel of the gameplay. Of course, the sound and the visuals ended up being a big step back, but hell, at the time there wasn't much else to compare it to. I really enjoyed this one, especially since I was a bit older when the home version landed. I actually remember Missile Command here because no one would let me play it. It was tough for me because the arcade used a trackball to move the cursor, and I was about as inaccurate as you could be in these games, literally hitting nothing and losing in spectacular fashion. It didn't take long for my family to realize it was a quick waste of a quarter to let me play it, so I was excluded on this one quite often. I love the idea though. Shooting missiles out of the sky and protecting your cities was such a cool concept. My little hands just couldn't control it well enough, so I was relegated to just watching the vast majority of the time. When it came home to the 2600, I was elated to see that it used the standard joystick, and I was much better at it. This is one where the visual cutbacks didn't really matter. It was a simple game in the arcade, so the home port didn't have a lot to live up to. While my family had excluded me in the enjoyment of the arcade version, I made up for it when it came home. One of my early favorites and most played games on the platform. Pac-Man is the first game on my list where I was old enough to actually play it on my own. My father loved this game and that made me want to be really good at it. And I must say I wasn't bad for my age. It was the first time my dad actually engaged in something I enjoyed, and I was thrilled. He was much better at it than I was, but I tried like hell to impress him each time I had a chance. Pac-Man was also one of the most popular arcade games I can recall. It was everywhere. You didn't have to look far to find it, so I remember getting a chance to play it quite often. My father would follow it home to the Atari 2600, which he would play for years despite the rather less than stellar conversion. It looked, sounded, and played nothing like the arcade in fact. The colors were muted, the stage layouts were different, and all the audio was just wrong. I would much rather play the arcade, but my dad loved it all the same. Even when I got my NES and was excited to show him a better home version, he shrugged it off and went right back to his Atari 2600. My first real lesson that some folks just don't appreciate change very much. Defender really was the first game of its type I had exposure to. It was a horizontal shoot-'em-up where you had to destroy an invading army while protecting your people. It was fast, flashy, and loud, and perfectly captured what the arcade experience was all about. It was hard too. The screen was loaded with enemies, and you needed to be extremely accurate with your shots to win. Like Pac-Man, this was everywhere. If a place had arcade machines in the early 1980s, you can bet one of them was a Defender. This is one of the earliest arcade games I can remember really kicking my butt. I sucked at it when it hit the Atari 2600 as well. It actually was not a bad port at all things considered, but it was still fairly difficult, especially with the stiff joystick the 2600 had. I remember everyone loving it at the time, but I just couldn't get into it much. Getting blown out the sky constantly tends to do that to me. I do still recommend having a look at it though. There's a sequel on the 2600 as well. We all have that game that comes along and really grabs our attention. Donkey Kong was one such title for me. It was so well paced and so full of personality that I just wanted to play it every time I had a chance. Running and jumping had never felt so good in digital form. Originally done by famed Nintendo legend Shigeru Miyamoto, you must rescue your lady from Donkey Kong, a massive gorilla hell-bent on your destruction. You battle across multiple screens before you finally fell the great beast, and it was one of the best games of its day. It had everything. Great graphics, unique sounds, and a story that gave every character an identity and purpose. I wanted to play it every time I saw it, which is still the case all these years later. The 2600 port managed to capture a bit of the magic when it was released in 1982. The gameplay is mostly intact, though we did see stages cut and a big audio-visual downgrade. I love the arcade version so much I just overlooked that, however, and enjoyed it quite a bit. I got so good at it I could play for a really long time before losing all my lives. I don't play the 2600 much these days, but when I do, this is the one that gets the call. I held a similar fascination with Frogger when I first played it. It was so cool to be able to move all over the playfield at will, with so many dangers all around you. Everyone loved Frogger too. My family, my friends, the arcade machine at the gas station was always being played, and it was a regular fixture beside Pac-Man and Galaga for years. Its home port was highly anticipated, and like Donkey Kong, one of my most played games for the 2600. It had the expected cutbacks, but still played great. My dad even played it in between sessions of Pac-Man, and we often battled it out for high score. It's also one of the first times I'd see Sega's name on a home game. This one was special, and I still have great memories of it. I loved Burger Time in the arcade. It was such a simple concept, but running from food to make food was gloriously stupid and fun. The aim was to drop the various pieces of burger onto the plates below by running across them. You had a pepper shaker to momentarily stun your foes, and you could use the falling pieces of burger to kill them. It had such memorable music, and it was really challenging. Unfortunately, this was around the time I really began to dislike the cutbacks in the 2600 ports. I was getting older and wanted to play games that looked and sounded like the arcade, and the 2600 was quickly wearing out its welcome. It played so slow and I just wanted more. I wanted accurate sprites, detailed play areas, and better sound. I played the 2600 home version a bit, but by 1984, my tolerance and patience for its ancient technology was reaching its end. Moon Patrol was a great game in the arcade. It was a horizontally scrolling shooter that had you jumping obstacles and blasting enemies. And lo and behold, there be parallax in those backgrounds. That's right, dude, this game absolutely floored me visually. I had never seen anything like it. It was so colorful and had so much depth in the backgrounds. I would watch people play it just to see the graphics scroll by. When I learned of the home version, I was stoked to get my own. I must have forgotten what system I owned though, because they butchered this on the 2600. It's not the same game at all. The cutbacks brutally changed the look and feel of pretty much everything. They tried to mimic the background layers, but it just comes off as choppy and much less impressive. By this point, my cousins were rocking the Intellivision and ColecoVision, so I was truly hating life with the 2600. I pleaded with my father could we upgrade, but he was still fine playing Pac-Man and Demon Attack. Namco's pole position was really popular in the arcade when it hit. That forward scrolling was super smooth and few companies had really tried anything similar at the time. There was also a wicked cool sit-down deluxe cabinet that really made you feel like you were driving. This, along with what Sega was doing, really lit a fire under my love of sprite scalers, which would really explode a few years later. And while the 2600 port was never gonna mimic the arcade accurately, I hated that version. The cars didn't look anything like cars. The screen scrolled differently and the sound just wasn't there. I began to really feel like an outsider at this point because many of my friends at the time seemed to love the 2600 release, while I just wanted to go back and play Frogger. I respect the attempt to do the game justice, but this just fell way short of the arcade's glory. Seeing Sega's Axon for the first time in the arcade blew me away. While I didn't care much for the gameplay, the visuals were incredible. You had to be aware of your height in relation to the objects around you, a gameplay trait I had never really seen before. It was colorful, smooth, and a hell of a challenge. When the 2600 version was released, I was both shocked and happy at the same time. Instead of a completely botched attempt at copying the arcade, this was basically an entirely new game. It ditches the isometric look for one that scrolls forward, similar to games like Buck Rogers. I was impressed by this, perhaps because it gave me something new to play instead of ruining software I already had expectations for. It was repetitive, choppy, and nothing like its source material, but for a 2600 game, I think it was a great way to go given the hardware's lack of power. I wanted to do this series of videos for a few reasons. First, I wanted to take you on a journey of games I played and enjoyed in the arcade, and also the home versions I had access to. There were other home ports besides the 2600 of course, but I wouldn't play them until much later, if at all. My cousins had machines like the ColecoVision, but they didn't let me play it very much. I also had no access to home computers at the time. Hell, it was 1992 before I played my first Commodore 64 software. This was a time when the arcade for me simply had no equal, and since my dad was more than happy with his 2600, I had no real way to explore the at-home alternatives. Many of my memories of these games are flashes, mostly created from the excitement that was generated by the people around me. As I got a few years older in '83 and '84, I had begun to really despise the 2600 for its lack of decent home conversions. I wanted the arcade, and that ancient technology from Atari just wasn't up to it. My dad did try to band-aid the problem by throwing games at me en masse. By 1984, the Great Gaming Crash had occurred in the United States, so 2600 software was selling for next to nothing in massive discount bins. This just made things worse, however. On top of being unimpressed with its audio-visual capabilities, I was then flooded with really bad games on top of it. This led to a time of disinterest in console gaming for me. I stuck to the arcade and just didn't pay any attention at all to what was available at home. That all changed in 1986, however, when I got my Nintendo Entertainment System. But we'll leave that for part 2. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.